is the author of Life Writing, Migration and Translation, and most recently co-editor with Ricia and Chansky of Life Writing Outside the Lines, Gender and Genre in the Americas in 2020, and with Elena Basile of Translation, Semiotics and Feminism, Selected Writings of Barbara Godard, published in 2022. She's also associate editor of AB, also Biography Study. Very enigmatic title, actually.
AB, it's
AB.
A/B, because you're talking about autobiographical practices, which is either auto or bio.
Okay, so we need a translation.
Yeah.
To understand the title.
So it covers
so
all,
welcome.
it's for all life writing practices, right? So it covers both self-authored and authored by others, right?
And thank you, Eva, for your generous contribution and ongoing contribution to the center's activities.
Thank you so much, Aurelia, for inviting me, and it's always such an honor to share what I work on and to hear from colleagues. Anyways, I'm just going to go cut straight to the chase, because I know that we've been already sitting here fumbling with my paper and the PowerPoint presentation. So you can see the title, Revitalizing Indigenous Languaging, and it's all meaningful, right? The Decolonial Voices of Leanne, Simpson, and Jeremy Dutcher. This is just going to be a visual, not real information there, but it provides links to sites where I hopefully will be able to take you. Maybe you'd have to put it in separate browsers, because I don't know if they are active. But anyways, like I say, the title clearly signals my engagement with some Indigenous material, which is not inherent to me, right? I'm a non-Indigenous. And I feel it's always appropriate to situate myself in relation to this kind of, thank you, okay, in a situation like that. So I've been living here as a settler for more than 30 years now, and I still consider it my duty to educate myself and do my homework with respect to the land that I occupy and the peoples from whom it's been stolen. And such learning is part of an ongoing and unfolding process of unsettling myself or ourselves when I'm doing this together with my students, decolonizing knowledge and building allyship, even if it's only aspirational, an aspirational project. So instead of doing land acknowledgement, which I will partly do because I want to share with you my parts of my land acknowledgement that I put in my syllabi, I just want to do it alongside some reflection on what this practice means to me. And I have noticed that over the years, my land acknowledgement has been evolving, also in conversations with Indigenous colleagues. But I always include it in my syllabi, and I find myself repeatedly rewriting it. What I always put there is to acknowledge my and our responsibility to recognize our colonial histories and their present day continuities. I also emphasize that in addition to taking land and sovereignty from Indigenous nations, white settler colonialism is centrally involved in imposing white ways of being and knowing and displacing Indigenous ones. And it's important to me, especially because I teach in gender and women's studies courses. I have to remind students that these are that gender, sexuality operate through a colonial framework. So these are impositions that include compulsory monogamous heterosexuality, the nuclear family structure, authoritarian, undemocratic, and physically violent means of wielding power between adults and children, and between men and women, and of course the binary heteronormative hierarchical gender system. But I also teach feminist methods and methodologies where it's not only coloniality of gender and coloniality of knowledge that pose challenges to us in the classroom, but it's questioning the very ways of engagement with Indigenous epistemologies and ethics. And this is something that I'm having ongoing discussions with my students. So in my syllabi, and I can quote some fragments from it, I acknowledge that I am an uninvited guest who has come to Turtle Island as an immigrant from Poland and gained white settler privilege. I live in Treaty 13 territory, the so-called Toronto Purchase from 1805, As a settler, it is my duty to educate myself out of respect for the land I occupy and the peoples from whom it's been stolen. And such learning, unlearning, is an ongoing and unfolding process. I am committed in my classrooms, in my life, to re-examine the false knowledge acquired through Eurocentric education, and I will continue to decolonize my teaching, thinking, writing, and being through processes like this evolving territorial acknowledgement, and including the recognition that the process of decolonization is not simply interchangeable with other social movements like feminism, for instance, with which I've been associated for a long time. So my own changing consciousness of my place and role in this process, has moved to fully accepting and supporting the validity of Indigenous demands of land restitution in a very concrete, not just metaphorical or symbolic sense. So the hashtag Land Back movement demands the return of colonized lands, without which the process of decolonization will not begin. The return of currently unceded occupied land is a real and rightful demand. And I always like to surprise my students with statistics. And when I tell them that actually 89 of Canada's territory is crown land, so 41, half of it more or less, 41% is federal crown land, and 48 is controlled by the provinces. And so the possibility of returning this to Indigenous peoples is very realistic. It just takes the will of different governments and the crown. So decolonization, first and foremost, necessitates the restitution of all land to Indigenous communities, returning what was stolen. This act is indispensable in unsettling, which works to reverse some of the damage of settler colonialism. And sort of like related to that, and I want to see it not as just a simple statement of land acknowledgement, but as I said, I emphasize the ongoingness and the processual nature of this relation to recognizing our place here as settlers. But there's also another aspect of it that is, and it's also pertinent to what I'll be showing you today. So it's the colonial archive. What it represents in terms of settler Indigenous entanglements. And as much as I, as a settler, have to constantly resituate myself in relation to this colonial archive, Indigenous cultural producers, writers, scholars have had a much more complicated and traumatic relationship to that colonial archive. And this is particularly true in the so-called Post-Truth and Reconciliation Commission moment, where unfortunately the government is still trying to control the narrative of reconciliation, offering neoliberal gestures, for instance, apologies, or even in 2019, passing Bill C-91, which is the Indigenous Languages Act, which recognizes the right to protection of Indigenous languages under Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982. Still, there's no land restitution attached to those gestures. And the entanglements with settler colonialism continue to be messy. So what I propose to do in this presentation is to examine briefly how the works of two Indigenous cultural producers, who, while remaining critical of so-called reconciliation, reorient themselves from colonial negativity and trauma towards a perspective of Indigenous futurism on Turtle Island. One of them is Jeremy Dutcher, an opera singer and ethnomusicologist from the Tobique Nation in New Brunswick. And the other person I'll be talking about is Leanne Betasamosake Simpson, a Mississauga Anishinaabe author, scholar, activist, musician, and educator. And I would like to start with her poem, if we can listen to it. There is this first link on the, okay, so should I do it? Would it take us there, you think? This is actually a poem called I'm Graffiti from 2015. She explains that she wrote this poem in response to the closing address of the TRC, which made her feel angry, not reconciled. So what she says is that and I quote here from one of her interviews, while some incredible work came out of the TRC and some survivors found solace in it, the Canadian government was not honorable and forthcoming in the TRC process, and it felt manipulative to me. It felt like it was a process to neutralize Indigenous anger without talking about returning land, sharing power, and decolonizing Canada. So Canada tried to assimilate Indigenous people. Mistakes were made. It didn't work. I'm still here. I am grateful. Thank you so much.
I can't hear.
UNDP, bah, et celui-là, je l'avais pas mis.
Can you hear me? I know that some people.
We can hear you, Ava, but you didn't remember to share the sound. So we can listen to it on our own.
Yeah, because you have to unshare the
Right.
Okay, post the link if you haven't had a chance to listen to it. copy it in the chat and you can play it on your own. But this is a very famous recording. I mean, it's been all over YouTube and I think people can see it.
It's a recording of the poem. Is it a recording of the poem, right?
Her reading a poem. It's just
Yeah, okay.
plus it is also, you know, showcasing her music. She's using like spoken word poetry set to her music. So that's like something that you don't want to miss, but you can do it on your own, I guess.
Okay.
You know, there's this sarcastic image of a new bright pink eraser, right, in the poem, which is obviously, you know, addressing the erasure of Indigenous experiences by the government in that whole process of so-called reconciliation, right? However, she moves from anger to strength, right, and sends a message of resilience and survival by comparing herself to graffiti. The poem is also there. So that culture, that experience will not be erased. And Simpson, as well as Jeremy Dutcher, they insert themselves differently into these complex settler colonial relationalities by modeling two different strategies of engagement with the settler colonial archive. That's what I want to show a little bit in the rest of this talk. So these two different strategies could be described as salvage and delinking, right? I mean, Jeremy Dutcher salvages archival materials, and well, Leanne Simpson partly delinks, but also works a lot towards some salvaging. So in that way, they both mobilize a decolonial and decolonizing potential of this engagement with the colonial archive. So both these approaches, salvage and delinking, are built on survival and persistence that have been crucial to 400 years, more than 400 years of Indigenous resistance to colonialism. And I recall here the late Basile Johnston, an esteemed Anishinaabe writer and ethnographer, who in his 1990 essay in Canadian literature warned that Indigenous languages were, and the title of this essay was "One Generation from Extinction." And how wrong he was in 1990, because today we can see the unprecedented renaissance of indigeneity, which also includes language revival. So two consecutive censuses, 2016, 2021, show that actually in 2016, more than 250,000 of Indigenous people in Canada reported the ability to speak the language. That number diminished slightly to 243,000 in 2021, possibly because the elders were dying, and so, you know, younger generations are taking a little bit slower to keep up. Dutcher's and Simpson's work that I would sample here and talk about defies this notion of dying languages, whether it is deployed by settlers or whether it is recognized as a problem faced from within communities. So they both retrieve and celebrate their people's respective worldviews encoded within the languages and rooted in what is, you know, comprised under the idea of Aki, which is the land, water, the spiritual and non-human realm. So this is the context and relation from which Indigenous resistance and resurgence can emerge. And Simpson often retells the well-known Anishinaabe prophecy, saying that, so according to this prophecy, we are all now living in the seventh fire, a time that follows, and I'm quoting here from one of her books, a long period of colonialism and cultural loss. And this period of the seventh fire belongs to a new generation of Indigenous people whose responsibilities involve reviving Indigenous languages, philosophies, political and economic traditions, ways of knowing and culture. Their work will determine the future, which is the eighth fire. But, she says, in order for the eighth fire to be lit, settler society must also decolonize their relationship with the land and Indigenous nations. So part of it has been acknowledged at the beginning. So one text that I'm looking at particularly today to show how this you know, engagement with the colonial archive can be performed in art and literature is Simpson's Islands of Decolonial Love, her very well-known collection of stories and songs from 2015 that creatively transposes indigenous epistemologies and traditions that she had explored and actually as a process of, relearning almost, in the earlier book called Dancing on Our Turtle's Back, Stories of Anishinaabeg Recreation, Resurgence, and a New Emergence. That was the book that she published in 2011. So she enacts the Anishinaabeg principle that the personal is collective and that each person must insert themselves into a received story, which is coming from communal lore. So she followed her elders in, she names them there, of course, in relearning those ways. And in Dancing on the Turtle's Back, and also in a later text, such as, for instance, her very famous essay, Land as Pedagogy, which I often use in my graduate classrooms, Simpson elaborates her emergent knowledge of Nishnabewin, which is Anishinaabeg intelligence. And she uses this interesting, it's like putting together different roots and pieces of words to create this kind of like holophrastic notation, where single word unit carry very complex meanings. So the complexity and sophistication of those concepts is really, like creating its own or constituting its own philosophical system. And in contrast of this kind of philosophical discourse, but also in parallel to it, she writes those short narratives interspersed with song poems, and they explore contemporary glimpses of indigenous life embedded in their colonial realities, but they offer moments of and opportunities for change and renewal. So Simpson's narrators find love, strength, redemption, as they try to unlock themselves from the legacy of colonialism, but there's always some kind of hope and learning from the elders, from ancestors, and of course turning to activism is all embedded in the framework. So, for instance, there's a story that she dedicates to her elder Edna Manitowabi, from whom she was, of course, acquiring this Nishnabewin, that is Anishinaabeg knowledge. And the story is dedicated to her, and she pays tribute in the story to a holy woman who persists in collecting, recording, memorizing stories, ceremonies, songs, dances, and a language that we'd almost forgotten, quote unquote, until she had, and again, quoting, a big basket full of those stories and those riches, right? So this whole idea of persisting in Indigenous art, literature, and scholarship is often articulated through the notion of haunting. And here I would like to play another, if we can make sure that this one will be heard. It's called, so this is also from Islands of Decolonial Lab. And it is one poem that I would like to play for you. It's Jibe or Andizoke. It is set to music and read by Leanne Simpson. But it's additionally, yeah, that's the thing that no, you need to copy this. It's not connected. I guess
Oh,
it's
okay.
not so you need to copy and paste in the browser. Okay. I hope it will work. So Jibe or Andizoke it has been performed by many people. It's a very much loved song. But this version that I'm going to play for you is actually enhanced with images that were synced by a Cherokee videographer, Laura Moon. And it was shot at the foot of Grandfather Mountain in North Carolina, which actually is a site of Cherokee burial mounds. And that relates directly to the words of the poem. So Simpson explains in Islands that Jibe is a ghost, a skeleton, and Andizoke is a messenger, a being from a traditional story, right? So can we?
I'm trying to find the cursor.
Oh wow, we having some problems, technical problems.
Wait.
But So what you actually see here again, the same performance type that she did in Graffiti. She's reading the poem, and it's set to music, and in collaboration with the whatever, you know, probably some of you are familiar with A Tribe Called Red, right? Just like, you know, a Juno Award-winning band. They are layering electronic dance music over traditional Anishinaabe songs. So you can hear that in the song, and that is kind of like combined with the imagery that the Cherokee artist is providing for it. I hope we can see it because it's a really beautiful performance.
To be very clear, and then I'll share there.
Yeah, you'll play it there. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So you're gonna have access to it through another computer, from another computer.
Computer. Okay.
See, I can say the word. Okay, fantastic. Is it sound?
I'm trying to put this sound. Yeah.
Is it?
I'll have to mute the other one.
Still echo.
So maybe we can just, how about also post it in the chat? Try to get the
It's echoing. It's echoing. It's not working.
Ah, and now the sound is gone completely.
Yeah.
But thanks for the link, all of the links, Sandra.
Yeah.
Much appreciated. We can listen to them.
Yes, I think now you can hear us.
Can you hear us now?
Yes.
Yes.
We'll listen to the poems on our own. We've got the links. We'll do that on our own.
Thank you so much. We should
Okay.
share this experience. It's a very moving experience listening to this poem, but I hope that we can see the music video, if we could set it up so that at the time when because that's Jeremy Dotter's original, you know, this one, yes.
This one.
If we can make sure that we can see this one in some way, that would be fantastic. It's coming, it's not now. I just want us to, okay, listen a little bit now about to this. So, you know, and if you, when you listen to this poem, you will notice that that Simpson, in her, uses this multimedia practice, right? In which she shares space in her work with artists who work in other media, and it adds like another dimension of entanglement to her work. So we're talking about all those entanglements. So several other poems in Islands have companion songs, right? And some of them on the disc that is available for the book also are read by Tatum Cardinal. And some of them, of course, Leanne Simpson is reading, but it's always grounded in multimodal collaborations with musicians and actors of Indigenous heritage. So on that one that you will be listening, Jibe, she's working with A Tribe Called Red, and it adds kind of, because they use electronic overlay, it kind of like also adds an additional like, you know, meaning to you know, urban Indigenous identity, so to say, right? So generally kinship, collaboration, partnership are deeply meaningful in Islands, and they show ways of bringing in communities into people's work. Haley Kirkwood, an Anishinaabe author, writes about interacting with Simpson Anishinaabe texts, their particular worldview, and she says it's very well suited to those, she calls them hybrid, I refer to them as entangled forms, and I quote, Anishinaabe understand our positionality in the world as interconnected and sincerely related to all living beings on earth, plants, animals, bodies of water, geologies, and the nations we work to live happily among. In Betasamosake work, this worldview is represented through structured story, lives alongside poem, alongside song. Each individual piece echoes an image or emotion or character that's come before and is transformed to fit that particular piece and its way of being. So in other words, it's like each lives beside the other to create this kind of like, indeed musical composition almost. So there is repeated imagery that provides that it functions like a connective tissue between poems and songs and stories. And it also ties to kind of generational memory, which is informed by embodiment, love, and land. For Simpson, the revival of language is key because language is a repository of stories that embody the intelligence, spirituality, skills, values, and pedagogies that can rebuild Anishinaabe culture. Although written in English, Islands is nevertheless conceptually scaffolded in Anishinaabe-Mowin, the language of the Anishinaabe nation, which is made of several groups, right, and related groups. Simpson's characters must work hard to regain their language. So that we see them taking courses in indigenous languages. They study Ojibwe English dictionaries, for instance, and they have to make a conscious effort to reconnect. The book itself is a dictionary. It has footnotes, which explain words used in the stories and in the songs. There are glossaries of words, such as Gejijaba, to cut, ababe, to forgive, to warm up, or to loosen one's mind, or loosen or unlock one's feelings, in addition to providing lists of animals, plants, traditional place names. So for Simpson, the process of acquiring language skills is transformative because there is this feedback loop between language, thought, and land. So the power of language can change her thinking and reconnect her also to the land. In this particular collection, we also get a better sense of Simpson's model of radical resistance, which in decolonial theory is called the linking, or she has her own equivalent of the linking. She calls it generative refusal, right? Generative refusal of the coloniality of power, knowledge, and gender. When, for instance, the narrator in her story called Smallpox Anyone, of course, the ironic title, mocks her teacher's idea of cultural syncretism and hybridity, telling her that she should do some blending of the things from settlers and some of the things from her ancestors that will allow her to, quote, weave them into a really nice tapestry, which will make the colonizers feel ambivalent. And then the narrator will have altered the power structure by making the colonizers feel, ambivalent. So that's similar kind of irony, similar kind of sarcasm that you also heard in I'm Graffiti, in that poem. So she articulates this much more radical position in a later text from 2017, as we have always done, Indigenous freedom through radical resistance. So the concept of radical resistance is fully fleshed out there. She calls for a return to embodied Indigenous practices of being and knowing as part of the project of resurgence, rooted in Indigenous thinking, theorizing, and organizing, which do not seek the recognition of or assimilation into the settler colonial state. So this generative refusal begins in everyday personal acts of turning inward to rebuild internally, to seek reciprocal recognition through meaningful relationships and creative pathways out of the enclosure of settler colonialism and into indigenous worlds. These everyday personal acts of resurgence and resistance in the present moment constellate to bring about indigenous futures. Simpson focuses on place-based and language-based resurgent education to raise the next generation of indigenous people who are grounded in indigenous intelligence rather than in a westernized education system. However, and this is really interesting, that I talk about ways of engaging with the colonial archive, but also of the messy entanglements. And it can be argued that Simpson work can't escape the messiness of those colonial entanglements, despite her advocating a politics of generative refusal. So she stays engaged with settler colonialism as she still offers a translation of indigenous ways of knowing, making them accessible to different audiences, including settlers, of course. Her article, Land is Pedagogy, contrasts the Anishinaabeg relationship to land as the catalyst for a decolonizing resurgent pedagogy, life practice, and grounded sovereignty, indigenous sovereignty. This relational understanding of land is, in an obvious sense, in direct contradiction with settler colonial practices of privatizing property or property in general. Land grounds the nation and the individual within its network of relationships. At the same time, it provides an important critique of Western pedagogical practices and academic institutions, and an alternative to them. So her work advocates for both the material and spiritual importance of land as relation, knowledge, and pedagogy. But in this sense, also, Simpson is amenable to appropriation, despite arguing for a resurgence of indigenous practices through generative refusals. Since she can also be easily, not so easily, but can be situated alongside settler colonial attempts to indigenize settler epistemology. So it's like a two-way process that, indigenous people cannot fully control, right? How their epistemologies, how their ideas are taken up to indigenize settler knowledges and practices. So this is the gesture, actually, this indigenizing is a gesture that she strongly detests when she's speaking of the Western academic industrial complex and its attempts to indigenize academy, which we are, of course, witnessing everywhere around us. So just to move to Jeremy Dotcher, because I know that it's been taking us a bit, I just want to play the official music video from his first album that probably a lot of us are big fans of. It won the 2018 Polaris Music Prize and the Juno Award for Indigenous Music Album of the Year at the 2019 Juno Awards. So similar to Simpson, but in a more literal, embodied way, Dutcher conjures voices from the past in order to create a new indigenous aesthetics. And the song that he recorded on that video is called Machinut, and it uses a callback and reach forward format. And I'd like to see with you this, original music video co-directed by Chandra Lebat and set designed by Emily Jan, which features Dutcher playing piano on stage at the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto. And there are dancers who are choreographed by Brian Solomon. And there are as well indigenous figures and activists participating. There's filmmaker Alanis Obomsawin, a tribe called Red is present, others. And there's also Leanne Simpson on in this video. Maybe you will be able to recognize her. So if you could see that now, it would be fantastic. He offers thanks here in the video, but there's also like a very interesting mini documentary. If you go to the website actually and watch the original music video on YouTube, there's a link underneath to a short documentary called Go Behind the Scenes of Jeremy Dutcher Machinot, which was released in 2019, where he talks about the making of the video and also thanks each collaborator. This video is called The Table of Indigenous Excellence. And he says it was an opportunity to bring out some of the best that Indigenous artistic communities from across this land have to offer. And this is kind of like looking towards and dreaming themselves into a new future. Obvious like symbols there that we could. So there are, you know, there was supposed to be like diverse representations of who Indigenous peoples are, and he also mentions that there is the syncretism or whatever it's still happening there. Obviously, he says that it was kind of inspired by Dutch still life, right? But was certain representation. So there's such a diversity of stuff there where, you know, you had people, there were sculptors who contributed pieces for the table, there were dancers, there were people sitting around it and offering, you know, their goods, their riches. So that's the image that was meant to convey a feeling of Indigenous joy, as he put it in his documentary. So Dutcher, you probably know that, is Woolworth's Talk Week. I'm maybe mangling the names, I'm sorry, but it's like Mali's lead as well, member of the Tobique First Nation, which means people of the beautiful river. That's about currently known as the St. John River in New Brunswick. He studied music and anthropology at Dalhousie University and trained as an operatic tenor in the Western classical tradition, which obviously we can hear. But then she started, you know, researching under the influence of one of his elders. He was directed by Maggie Paul was the elder who directed him to the recordings that are stored in at the Canadian Museum of History. And some people in the community, among them Maggie Paul, remembered that at the beginning of the 20th century, there came a white guy who collected songs from the people. So the memory of that event sort of persisted, even though probably they didn't have a chance to go and listen to them in the Canadian Museum of History. So William Merling was the guy, the anthropologist, who made more than 100 wax cylinder recordings of people from this Tobique Nation. Of their original songs that are no longer actually being passed on to younger generations. And actually, Wolastoqiyik is among the endangered languages. Today there are about 100 people who speak it. Dutcher recorded his debut album that we've just seen one song from, based on this research into the archival recording. And he speaks in interviews a lot about those songs and his project. He says that he aims to preserve both Wolastoq culture and language through his music and inspire Indigenous youth to think about the importance of language. So when he was asked about his decision to record in his native language, Dutcher stated, "It is less about asking people to learn a new language and more about disrupting the bilingual Anglo-centric Canadian music narrative. Up until that point, there have been no popular, why have there been no popular records in my language?" He's asking a rhetorical question, of course. So when he received the Polaris Prize, he addressed the audience in Wolastoq with the phrase that meant, "All of my people, this is for you." So the language played an important part there. And when you look at Dutcher's project of repurposing for reparative purposes, the ethnomusicological samples that an ethnographer, anthropologist collected more than 100 years ago, you might think about it as some kind of salvage autoethnography, collective autoethnography, because it's about his people. It is also an example of verbatim aesthetics or aesthetics of authenticity, As such, it is similar to what some other indigenous poets, for instance, are doing. And I'm thinking here, for example, of Nisga'a poet Jordan Abel's subversive decontextualizing of Marius Barbeau's ethnography in the place of scraps from around the same time, 2014, 2013, I guess. So both Abel and Dutcher navigate the terrain of the settler colonial archive, whose epistemic and ideological biases have been much criticized, for example, by such archival scholars as Anne Stoller. At the same time, they are reading against the grain, and that has also been recognized as a valid decolonial methodology. So they have navigated this terrain of the settler colonial archive, salvaging this work to cultivate, perhaps the connection to the past, but also demonstrating paradoxically that hostile space of the colonial archive which is the site of discursive violence, can also be tapped by indigenous people where they can find some of their knowledge preserved, sort of like, again, against the grain. So Dutcher's work represents a particularly interesting example of engaging with the archive, because it demonstrates that one can develop more generative projects, not just projects of critiquing the archive, but generate something new from the detritus of colonialism, right? So there are things that exist in deeper layer that can be, used and recovered. At the same time, of course, because it's an indigenous creator coming to the archive, it is unsettling the subject-object dualism of Melling's ethnography, and agency shifts, and the songs arrive as a gift, right, from the ancestors. So that it also, when he blends the voices and music of his ancestors with his classical European musical techniques, he creates those breathtakingly beautiful, sublime arias and ballads on this album, where those found recordings are incorporated to a striking effect. At the same time, he refers to this space, to his music, as an irreconcilable space, which is the space where he returns the gifts to his people. So it's a reciprocal gift. It comes from the ancestors and goes back to his people. But it is also irreconcilable in the sense similar to what Yftag speaks about when she's talking about incommensurability of this, kind of encounter between settlers and indigenous people. So it's irreconcilable because, he says settlers can listen to it, but are not necessarily able to understand because there's no translation, no English version. And in one interview, he was talking about the possibility of eventually doing a video in English and translating, like showing some pronunciation or whatever. But his priority is not to translate what he wants to say to his community. So altogether, the video and the album, through their complex aesthetic entanglements, demonstrate that he exists as an artist, as this complicated space, right? Where he says, and I quote here from one interview, that he cannot undeniably, he says, undeniably, I can't turn off my classical training just as much as I can't turn off my culture in those classical spaces. So it's not dualism, it's really like entanglement. He says that he undertook this project to counteract a familiar colonial history of systemic dispossession of indigenous cultures, languages, which we know through residential school narratives and educational systems that devalued indigenous knowledges. He is absolutely convinced, like Leanne Simpson, that this loss can be reversed And that his work fulfills the promise that Leanne Simpson is talking about, the eighth fire, but also the promise spoken by his elder, Maggie Paul, in the third song of the album. When you, and here is the quote from what Maggie Elder says, when you bring the song back, you will bring the dances back, you are going to bring the people back, you are going to bring everything back. And this is where the projects, Simpson's project and Dutcher's project, converge. And for them, for Dutcher explicitly, it is, he says, it's his art emerges from indigenous futurism, a viewpoint whose cornerstone is recovering the use of traditional languages, given that their grammatical structures signal, among other things, a profound connection to the land. So for instance, in the Wollastok term for multiple trees is equivalent to 3 people our relatives, which indicates viewing the non-human world as family, and it reflects a fundamentally respectful relationship with those trees. Another example of the worldview contained within language relates to the absence of gendered pronoun in Wollastok. And it allows Dutcher, who is two-spirited, to reject, quote, the silly colonial gender binary that seems to have washed up on the shore of this land. So he explicitly, challenges that. And it's also reflected in his involvement in LGBTQ+ activism. So on the national scene, he was responsible for Indigenous outreach at EGAL, Canada's leading organization for two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans questioning and intersex people. So the intersection of identifying as both Indigenous and two-spirited allows him to speak out on the indigenization of queer spaces and advocating for a less Western way of thinking about gender. Like Simpson's, his activism is also oriented towards a critique of the government-imposed notion of reconciliation. And I don't know if you had a chance to watch his Juno Award speech in 2019, but he wanted to use his acceptance speech to critique the Trudeau government's approach to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. But his speech was interrupted partway, and he was played off the stage. He had to find, he had to find another venue. He delivered it later in a different venue. But that's what was seen on the national television. So just to conclude now, because I feel like I want to leave some time for people to talk. Both Dutcher's salvage ethnography and Simpson's recuperation of embodied knowledge are profoundly spiritual processes that generate new ways of knowing and becoming, seeking a new path away from coloniality of culture, language, and being. But as conduits of Indigenous resurgence, they practice embodied meaning-making, intimate, personal, contextual, and relational, woven within kinship structures, emotions, spiritual presence, the collective consciousness and intelligence. Again, and I speak about it in some other places, I've been kind of recognizing the need to maybe move away from the concept of language towards the concept of languaging, right? Languaging is a conceptual shift that may be useful in trying to describe their ethical onto-epistemological practices that resonate with the new materialist understandings of language as a complex, embodied and embedded, affective, cognitive, bio-socio-cultural activity of sense-making, which involves generating meaning through engaging one's mind, body, emotions, and spirit within a web of interdependent relationships. So that process can also be recognized as delinking from the colonial premises of, art making and self-representation, which, colonial notions of individual self, identity, authorship, right, have to be replaced by a relation to family, community, the land, relations that can produce generations of loving, creative, innovating, self-determined. These are Leanne Simpson's quotes. So loving, creative, innovative, self-determining, interdependent, and self-regulating community-minded individuals. There's a lot packed into that ideal that she wants people to aspire to. And I just want to conclude with this, returning briefly to the recordings that I offered you earlier, the poems, Mechinut, the song that Dutcher performed, is about death and the celebration of cycles. It's about passing between states of being. It stages a ghostly performance in the voices of the dead ancestors, granting them agency to come back to the future. Simpson's spoken word poem that we haven't listened to, but you have a link to, brings back the ghost of the woman whose burial mound has been defiled. So they both, in different ways, embrace such hauntings as signs of continuity, duration, and persistence within and again against settler colonial frames. Thank you. Thank you for your patience with this longish and kind of technically.
Wow, thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, probably more just enjoy the techniques, enjoy the yeah.
Super interesting, Eva.
Thank you.
Yeah, but
Wow.
that
Yeah.
has already performed here in London, no?
Really, Dutcher has performed at Glendon? I didn't know
I think
about it.
so. I think so.
Wow.
Mhm.
Did he? Wow, I missed that. Whoa. The year I discovered this CD, everybody got it for Christmas.
I mean, and there's
He's
something
an amazing artist, performer, thinker, exceptional, yeah.
I was wondering because I've been trying to find what he's done since, right? Really deeply involved in activism. He's become like a celebrity that suddenly is visible and can be an ambassador of some uncomfortable truths or whatever. But I don't think that he has published his second album yet. Has anyone heard? I was trying to.
No, I haven't heard anything. I think.
So
I think
it's still
sort of,
in his discography. It's only this one, right? It's still that one, and so interesting, right? Like that he hasn't been. He made this music video, where he's hugely artistically invested in making it. And he performs a lot, right? I mean, but it's still those songs, right? And Leanne Simpson, on the other hand, is like, oh my goodness, incredibly productive all the time. I don't know if you've seen, she recently published, after the pandemic, right? She and Robin Maynard, who is Black Lives Matter kind of connected, when she's connected to Black Lives Matter, and it's also in the abolitionist movement, and so on. They published their emails, sort of, because they were in correspondence during the pandemic. And they published a book called Rehearsals for Living, which is about, and this has been a huge process going on for several years now, trying to build some kind of like lateral solidarity. So rather than focusing on the relationship between, like I've been mostly looking at it here, right? Settler Indigenous archive, right? Settler Indigenous relations. Indigenous people look sideways now to like racialized people, racialized settlers, and try to forge some kind of like transversal relations with them, since they are differentially present in the current neoliberal, whatever, capitalist, settler colonial, patriarchal, whatever, heteronormative frame, and they kind of like try to unpack this and critique the system together. So this is one such collaboration. So it's not just like here, I was looking mostly at like Jeremy Dutcher and other Indigenous artists. There were some people who are not Indigenous collaborating on the video, but specifically for Simpson, it's important to have conversations with other oppressed people on Turtle Island, right? So not just like internal conversations in Indigenous communities, but so the goal is to make sure that, I mean, well, there's been a huge controversy even here at York around Inadua and Bonita Lawrence, for instance, right? Who wrote this piece where they were kind of like arguing against people of color not feeling that they are settlers, right? So that was this debate, and this is like, you know, accepting that people have different relationships to being settlers. It's not like just a simple binary settler indigenous, but that it's complicated within each category, right? So she's having those conversations now with Robin Maynard, and it's a very accessible, very deep, but at the same time, you know, very direct way of unpacking the complexities of power relations within racialized, you know, settler colonial states. We do it together, and yeah. I don't know. I mean, she's also performing. I would love to show you a lot more, but there was, for instance, she's got her own band. It's just 3 people, but including herself. But they do perform. They do perform songs actually that she writes, and in those recordings here, they were like you know, spoken word poetry recordings. But normally she also records concerts. She sings, and it's a different kind of singing. It's more like, I don't know, like folk tradition than what Jeremy Dutcher is doing. But music is absolutely like integral to both of them. So
Can I ask you something, Eva? Because I'm thinking about all these things too, and I think you've done here an analysis of what they are doing, the processes and the critique of appropriation or of selective appropriation. That's also one of the things that they're critiquing. And I was just wondering, they're very radical. Would there be any place for a dialogue with a settler, so as we are, even if we emigrated a while ago, me too, from Europe, in an aim to do something creative, which would not be in the mold of the traditional colonial framework? Or is there no place for us? Is that something that belongs to them only?
I think that everything they do actually is about. Of course, it's for their communities, but it's not separatist, right?
Yeah.
And what she says is very crucial, that as long as settlers refuse to recognize that they are settlers, actually, right?
Yeah.
And to support Indigenous push for the return of land, right? People just, I mean, I always tell my students, because they say, how you imagine that? And even recently I went to a like stand-up comedy by an Indigenous comedian who's very funny actually, and he was saying, like he directly engaging with the audience. So when I talk about the return of the land, you worry that I'll ask you to give up your homes and give them back to us.
Yeah.
Are usually like drawing the line, right? I'm okay, fine, let's be allies, but I want to stay in my home, right?
Yes.
Probably need to do that. I don't think that that's exactly what they are asking for, like, you know, that people give up their homes. It's more about redistribution of this vast mass of land, right? I mean, it's shocking that actually Indigenous reserves in Canada are about 2% only of the entire land mass. I mean, these are, like, you know, I recently discovered the power of statistics, like I said earlier. And when I tell my students, it's actually the whole land that is given up, whatever, by the Crown for Indigenous reserves. It's the size of one reserve south of the border, I guess in South Dakota or whatever. So one big, and I'm not saying that Americans are good or bad or whatever in terms of they have a horrible record of treating Indigenous people. However, you know, this is one big lie in Canada around this issue of Indigenous land, you know. Some people were hoping now that with King Charles, maybe that debate will be reopened, and we will start kind of like becoming a little bit more receptive to the idea of indeed, you know, returning the land to the communities from which it had been stolen, right? And if you think about it, it's like literally only 11% of land in Canada is private land, remains in private hands, right? So that is shocking. It's such a huge land. So I do think that there are certain things that need to change. And I know, I mean, in my own life experience, some things at a particular historical moment sound absolutely impossible or undoable or unimaginable. And even, you can imagine them, right? But things shift and understandings change. And like, this is this amazing moment. I'm just like, for me, the moment like that was when communism fell behind the Iron Curtain, the fall of communism in 1981.
Yeah.
Childhood and youth behind the Iron Curtain. And I could never imagine, like, oh my God, how would that ever require, I don't know, the fall of this colossus to the east, which has been unfortunately reborn with Putin now and is, spreading its aggression. But it did happen in 1989, and it was like a total remaking of my view. And I think some, like, unbelievably, I don't know, cataclysmic, whatever, monumental change will take place in our relationship as well. Maybe not cataclysmic, but at least, really, really important. So, and it is almost cataclysmic now because, what is happening to the environment and climate change. There is this moment, as some people say, we need to, change our thinking and being here. I think we are absolutely a part of this. So it's not like being, separatist. It's more about, and I think even going back to the beginnings, right? One amazing thing about Indigenous cultures has always been that they were so receptive to otherness, to others, even to other religions, right? Which was eventually their undoing, right? For many groups. We have this syncretic kind of, sensibility that they open to taking children from others and raising them as their own, taking other people's religions and respecting them and putting them alongside their own beliefs. It's like something that the Eurocentric mind is not really capable of, right? Because there's always this kind of hierarchical binary thinking embedded in it. And if we can learn to be binary and more like, open with that. So it's fascinating.
And that would be beyond the term ally. That's why the term ally is actually not a good term. Ally, you're still keeping your territory, you're still Eurocentric, and you're just educating yourself a little bit, and but not really, and you're not critiquing all your assumptions. So maybe education is okay, because then there's hope that you may just critique the whole thing. Ally is not.
I guess disappearing. I understand the intention behind this whole idea of allyship, right? Like, it's like a non-aggressive, non-threatening, whatever.
Yes. It's still nice. It's still nice.
Yes. Right? But allyship, if it means I will support you, I will stand in solidarity with you when you ask for your land. That's in that sense allyship, right? Just like, oh, I'm a sympathetic observer, right? Or whatever, something like that.
Yeah.
So that's what needs to shift, and I believe it will eventually shift. I'm curious. I hope I'll live to see it. Interesting.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting what we been reading right now, because I sense that there is a shift from post-coloniality or post-colonialism into decolonization and this process that is much more, I don't know, positive, right? And I think that when you said that it's like a movement, onward movement, right?
Yeah.
So it's not that the colonizer who did so many horrible things to us and who othered us in such a violent way, but now we are trying to confront that self-othering process. And I think that's the main theme for me in this decolonizing process, right? So I see it as very positive, because then there's this liaison or disentanglement may take place, and then of course maybe some kind of dialogue, much more productive,
absolutely
ongoing, may bring some positive and long-lasting concrete results. So I see it as something very, very positive.
Yeah, me too. I actually get, I mean, I see the optimism and the hope, and it's like he uses this word futurity, and Black scholars also talk about futurity. So it's future oriented, and it's like, you know, like you say, absolutely that turning away, they refuse to dwell in that, you know, trauma or, and it doesn't mean that you do not honor it, honor the memory, or that you erase this history, but it doesn't define you anymore because you evolve towards like all those things that you can now sort of like show to the world, right? In a way that restores agency, in a way of creating a future rather than constantly hampered by, you know, shackled to the past, right? Yeah.
And we have, I mean, last weekend, on Saturday, last Saturday, we had our annual maths conference. And it was on about unheard voices. It was very interesting and like hearing and listening to, right, how these two auditory processes are different. So so I would say that Westerners or settlers should learn how to listen to, right? Because hearing is very easy. It's I can hear and acknowledge and repeat some acknowledgement, but in everyday life doesn't make any change. But the process of listening to us, Emmanuel Levinas was insisting on
Listening, absolutely.
And the opening, really
and also
welcoming.
this idea also of responsibility, right? I mean, this is not just responsible with an I, but responsibility, right? That you listen and you have this capacity for responsibility, that you respond, it becomes part of your life, you engage with it as well, right? So just like even beyond listening, it creates, it kind of like rocks you into the process.
But
it might be
kind
transformative,
of,
right?
Listening is a predisposition that allows you to develop another.
Because like you say, they cannot be
relationship.
They cannot be response without listening, right? No, absolutely. Otherwise, it's like being in your own bubble all the time, right? And it's like I mentioned this class that I teach, feminist research methodologies, hugely, like steeped in indigenous voices and so on. And we had guest speakers, indigenous guests who came and talked to PhD students in gender, feminist, women's studies. And we're very cautious about like this whole idea of, I'm going to do my PhD with using indigenous methodologies or whatever. So the whole, warning about how you engage with it, why you engage with it, this is not very, but also a very interesting thing that our colleague, who is Angèle Alouk from Big Cree, what is it called? Oh gosh, from the Cree Nation in Alberta, Big Stone Cree Nation, right? She came and she talked to us and she said that actually it's very important for her to have those collaborations with non-Indigenous scholars. And even in field work, like this is to answer partly your question, Jennifer.
Yeah.
Indigenous scholar who says, I wouldn't be able to do so much if I were just doing it in my own way, even in my own community. Because when I come with a collaborator who is non-Indigenous, she sees different things from what I see. And our becomes like different, So yes, insist on, she says, I value so much those collaborations because, we cannot do everything, right? So you bring in non-Indigenous scholars to collaborate with you, and then not only your vision is different, but also you do not burn out so fast because you're this kind of, process. So I was very grateful to her for saying that, because it always feels like imposition or appropriation or whatever. But well, it comes with an invitation, I guess. She says the collaborations have to grow organically. It's not like, some kind of taken for granted thing that, And it's like, for instance, Shirk is doing that, right? And we've seen that many times that once Indigenous content was promoted, maybe not so much now, as it's still important, but in the first phases, a lot of people were jumping on the bandwagon and just, creating some bogus collaborations just to be qualified for Indigenous content, right? So this cynical kind of extractive approach, even to that, in particular to that.
I think institutions also must do the work that we are trying to to do, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
because
really
we are
do it
in-
in a very respectful,
yeah.
a humble way instead of this triumphant, right? Because we can't have many, giving
Yeah.
away many grants, right?
Thank you so much.
A lot of this collaboration has to is based then on trust, and the people, the indigenous people, have to know where you're coming from, what from an institution you're coming from, what your ultimate motives are. If you're really trying to understand and trying to get behind what has happened and moving on, then a lot of creativity can be unleashed, and that could be very, very good. But then it's a real participation. You're not paid by the government to do something, you're not an agent of the government.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but York is showing us how, well, to instrumentalize indigeneity to create a better public relations, image or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we think that, for example, these ethnographers, this Polish people who were imprisoned, in Siberia by SARS,
Yeah.
that suddenly would discover this, communities living completely unknown to the
Yeah.
world, and then they would start doing research as prisoners, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. Do you know anything, any publication about this type of,
Here in Canada,
or in,
Yeah.
in Poland
In
as well?
Poland.
Because we might learn something from them.
yes, I think that, well, the most recent that I've heard of is a different thing. It's more like a tradition of investigative journalism about residential schools, right? So this Polish journalist got award for nonfiction by writing about Canadian residential schools. You may have heard of that.
No.
If you don't have it, I have it. I can mail it to you.
Okay, thank you.
You'll be interested.
Yeah.
But about Siberia, I think there's quite a big spread of writing. I'm not following too much, but about like life writing and stories, right? Recovered from there. But whether this kind of research with indigenous communities in Siberia, for instance, that would be interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know that. I'm going to Warsaw to a conference in June, I will ask, because this is a life writing conference actually. So maybe there will be people who
I
know.
will be also for conference.
You will be
Also
there?
in July. Yeah.
In July.
Yeah, in July.
Oh, is it IABA Warsaw by any chance?
I think so.
So we will be there together.
Oh, really?
Is
No,
it-
no, it's about community interpreting. So
Oh,
no,
so that's
no,
different.
so that's a different.
So we're talking
yeah.
about, we're trying to, but what's dates in July are you gonna be there? Because mine is from 4th to 8th.
Mine is, I think, from 6 to 8 or something.
So we
like
will overlap.
Yeah,
And maybe
we
we
will.
can be in touch and see if we can.
Yeah,
you know, yeah.
What is your conference, Eva? Which is mine?
The auto/biography, the title that you read,
Yes,
AB.
yeah, AB. Yeah.
Auto/biography.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's called IABA World. It's happening at the University of Warsaw.
Yeah, mine too. Yeah.
Yours too.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, look at
Yeah,
that.
that is in community.
Wow.
So many refugees right now. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
suddenly.
Yeah, and I'm on a conference in July too in Brussels. It's a pragmatics conference, and I've been invited to a round table about non-Indigenous learners of Indigenous languages.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
So I hope that the new course, level 1, will be ready,
Yes.
I have to contact John because I was so busy
Yeah.
right now. So I didn't really have time
Yeah,
to.
I've got an exam on the 23rd of May in Inuktitut. So before that, I haven't got time because I've got to really concentrate. But afterwards will be good.
How many Indigenous languages have you learned?
I'm concentrating on Inuktitut at the moment. Yeah.
Okay.
And it's a fantastic course in Paris. It's absolutely brilliant prof, and it's really good. And so it's a difficult language, but it's really well taught. So trying to hang in there.
That offers.
Yes, so that's I'm talking about this because
You're
John,
talking about that.
yes, but John gave the level
Yeah.
2.
I only did
Yes.
level 1,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
so there are people from Poland, India, interested in taking that course, and Jennifer as well. So
Yeah.
we start another turn of
So
level
maybe
1.
ask again.
Great.
Are you gonna take Wendat with him?
Yes.
I found that there was a lot of introductory stuff first,
Yes.
like before, and I don't know if we can. I mean, any practical. I didn't kind of like gain any practical
I
knowledge.
see, but
you know what I mean?
John is
He's
a very
Polish.
different
Yeah.
teacher, right?
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
But it was fascinating, the whole
it
philosophy
is,
of language,
it
you know?
is, yeah.
Like even here what Dutcher says, there are no gender pronouns, or
Mhm.
there are verbal ways
Mm.
of talking about the world rather than, you know, objects, things. Not the
Mhm.
thingness, but the doings, right, are important. And that is so beautiful, right?
Yeah,
It's-
but I think if I understood well, John is not actually really speaking the language.
Right.
So he's studying the language, right?
Ah.
Okay, yeah.
By the
Yeah.
practice.
It's a difference.
I'm not sure how, but
Yeah.
it's very
But it is an entry into a whole philosophy of life.
absolutely.
Exactly. Just want to get an idea, just get a little taste of it. You're at the Kiel campus, are you, Eva? Usually?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. But I'd love to go on with the discussion and with Aurelia and with you and because I'm really into this now and I found your paper absolutely fascinating. It was really wonderful. So thank you so
we'll get
much.
After our trips, after the conference,
Yes,
right?
great.
Yes.
And then-
Yeah. Would be good in the summer to get together. You know, we don't have to go to campus. We can meet downtown too. Yeah.
Thank you.
In
Thank
the
you so
beaches,
much.
Yeah,
Okay.
in the beaches, right?
In the beaches
In the
or
beaches.
downtown, or there's so
Yeah.
many cool places everywhere.
Somewhere on the
Thank-
lakeside, somewhere down. Yes. Okay, I gotta go now. So that thing hasn't come yet, but it was wonderful that I could join by Zoom. So unfortunately I wasn't there person, but you did it in a very lively way. So it was great. It was great anyway. See you soon. Thanks so much.
A wonderful summer. If we don't see
You too. You
Thank
too. Have a good time in Europe. I will all be in Europe at the same time. Different conferences.
we'll find each other through Aurelia, maybe, right? When,
Yes,
when
yeah,
we'll be back.
yeah. Absolutely.
Okay. Okay.
Bye.
Okay. Keep in touch. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Leave.